The Politics of Science by Thom Cantrall. There are many who would place science on a pedestal as being above the petty machinations of politics and being pure. Nothing is further from the truth. Science is probably the most politically infested discipline known. Just try to get a fair hearing if the word Sasquatch or Bigfoot is mentioned in it. From Einstein to ClimateGate, from the giants of the Edema Mound to the Sasquatch Genome Project, the scientific community is the most status quo institution imaginable. They do all they can to promote the farce of man-made global warming and hide their heads in the sand if someone mentions Sasquatch or Bigfoot. Here is an example of that bias. Dr. J. Harlan Brett was excoriated brutally for his theories of the great floods of the Columbia, to the point there was a tribunal who attempted to drum him from the corps of geologists. That theory is accepted fact today, but Dr. Brett had to wait until he was in his 90s before acceptance was forthcoming. Here is his story. In our modern society, there is a subset of people involved in and dedicated to the investigation of a large, hairy, bipedal being who is said to inhabit the wild areas of North America. Within this subset are several separate factions that range from those wishing to hunt down and kill this being to those adamantly devoted to the sanctity of his life. There are some few in the academic community who have endorsed this effort, and even fewer who participate in it. At a glance, it would seem that there is now a very elite group who have set themselves up as a judge of some sort over the actions and findings of others. One of these factions is the science-only group. These people insist that if it isn't scientific, it isn't admissible. They call for strict scientific proof of each and every claim, and believe themselves as some kind of anointed, more than a holy curator of all knowledge. We all know these people believe themselves to be a special form of judge in a world of unwashed amateurs who are daring to set themselves up as some sort of expert in a field which few understand, let alone can teach. All too often, these people would have others believe that no one is allowed independent thought without the permission of this elite group, against all logic to the contrary. It has been held up to us as independent researchers that these people with doctor or professor before their names, or PhD as a suffix, lends them an aura of invincibility and puts them into a state wherein they cannot be questioned, that they are on some sort of ivory tower that denies the possibility of being incorrect. Is this warranted? Does being part of a fraternity of the university set actually install this type of umbrella over them? Let us examine this a bit closer by studying an incident that occurred in the last century in the region of the country where I live. In the field of geology, the underlying theory of formations has changed drastically over the lifetime of our nation. Prior to the middle of the 19th century, virtually all geology was attributed to catastrophic changes wrought by the biblical floods. Around the middle of that century, a decided shift began toward the notion of long-term, uniform alterations. It was held that any geological alteration came about only through eons of wear and tear by the elements. This uniform theory became known universally as uniformitarianism, and is the operative theory well into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, airplanes began giving geologists a new view of the world they were trying to make others understand. One of the grandest discoveries was in eastern Washington and a few miles north of the Trans-State Highway I-90, south to the Oregon border, and was an area of rocky surfaces, scabland, with virtually no topsoil. Indeed, no soil of any kind was on this surface. It is a land of spectacular rock formations, mostly from basalt and deep, dry coulees. It looked for all the world like the bed of a lake with the water surgically removed. The idea that the established theory might not be entirely correct first occurred in 1910 with publication of the Quincy, Washington topography maps. Dr. J. Harlan Bretz, on viewing these new publications, began to wonder about the truth of this matter, and in 1922 began a study of the area with the help of a handful of geological graduate students. With Dr. Bretz at the head, they climbed over, under, and around the most interesting formations of the region. This led to the formulation of a new hypothesis. In 1923, Dr. Bretz decided to share what he was observing in the field and published 2 separate papers on the subject. He presented his observations to the Geological Society of America. In that work, he presented a simple description of what he had been seeing on the field trips. It was obvious that he had taken care to not provide interpretations or an explanation. He simply left any conclusions to his readers. However, in his second paper of 1923, he did shake up his peers somewhat by announcing his theory that a huge, catastrophic flood was responsible for the creation of the geological features of the channeled scabland of the area. His work was initially received with less than a full fanfare. Indeed, his peers ridiculed him outrageously for even suggesting that this formation was a result of anything but uniform erosion effected over millions of years. The paper published in 1922 by Joseph Pardee that postulated a large ancient lake in the area east of the Idaho Panhandle that Dr. Pardee named Lake Missoula was used as ammunition against Dr. Bretz by those assaulting them. In that work, it had been postulated that the Spokane-Palouse scabland had been created by unusual glaciation over extremely long periods of time. When Dr. Bretz went to visit the area in contention, he found that the glacial deposits were in fact flood bars, berms of soil pushed up by floodwaters and not by glacial action. In fact, after Dr. Pardee learned of Dr. Bretz's work, he changed his own opinion and agreed with Dr. Bretz. Meanwhile, those who had never been there and had never seen the features nor the area of concern continued to excoriate Dr. Bretz for heresy in terms of claiming there might be something at work here beyond their ken. Prior to 1927, many geologists were beginning to understand the ramifications of what Dr. Bretz was promoting. They began to realize that if, indeed, this theory were true, uniformitarianism would be essentially dead. As one can understand, the hue and cry from the established geological community was great. The desire to maintain the status quo was so profound that there began a campaign to publicly discredit and humiliate the doctor. To effect this public hanging, Dr. Bretz was asked to present his theory to the Geological Society of Washington in public forum. If Dr. Bretz had been in any way aware of the underlying purpose of this gathering, or even how hostile his audience was going to be to his ideas, he probably would have eschewed the entire event. But, understanding what he had already weathered, I seriously doubt he would have sidestepped an inch, but would have welcomed the opportunity to enlighten the world to what was to him so patently obvious. In fact, the 6 challenging elders, as he later referred to the Inquisition panel, were out to bury him totally in a public debate. The session opened by Dr. Brett's premier and most outspoken critic, Dr. W.C. Alden. Alden wasted no time in attacking Brett's position by suggesting that the features he observed could be easily explained away as being collapsed lava tubes. What you're seeing here is nothing more than misidentified bears. He continued, "A flood large enough to create these features would require an incredible volume of water." He then stated unequivocally that such a volume of water was simply impossible to achieve. Cloaking is beyond the realm of possibility. Mind speak is absolutely impossible. It must be, he reasoned, that there is another source for the origin of these features that must be responsible. Other speakers, in their turn, took their best shots at the beleaguered geologist. In their current state, given enough time, the small rivers in the area would have accounted for their formation. Instead of a catastrophic flood of magnificent proportions sweeping over the region in a relatively short time, they insisted that these rivers took millions of years to carve out the scabland features. They maintained that Dr. Brett should abandon his ludicrous notion. Anyone who believes that is delusional. It was not until while in attendance at a conference in 1942 that Dr. Brett heard the full explanation of Dr. Pardee's ancient Lake Missoula. According to this model, Dr. Pardee demonstrated how the Okanagan lobe of the great northern glaciers had effectively blocked the modern named Clark's Fork River in the area of present-day Lake Pend Oreille in the panhandle of Idaho. This created an ice-dammed lake larger than present-day Lake Ontario and Lake Erie combined. This great lake was nearly 2,000 feet deep at the dam and contained over 500 cubic miles of water. Suddenly, 2 decades after Pardee's first published mention of the phenomenon, Dr. Brett had his water supply. Subsequent investigation revealed great layered tiers of sedimentary deposit in the area where a large temporary lake, Lake Lewis, was formed by the constriction of the outflow at Wallula Gap, just downstream of the modern city of Kennewick. This restriction held back the flow from the channel's scablands and formed a pool of water some 700 feet deep that filled the entire Columbia Basin. This constriction allowed time for the massive amount of material carried by the rushing floodwater to settle out into sedimentary beds called tushy beds. At the beds near the tiny town named for them, there are 39 beds, one atop the other, indicating that at least 39 times the flood sequence repeated itself. This indeed was the mass of water needed to satisfy Dr. Brett's requirements, and by the 1950s, most of the geological scientists of the world recognized the veracity of his theories, and he was not only exonerated, but was, in 1979, at the age of 96, given the highest award presented in the field of geology, the Penrose Medal, which rewards one researcher each year for exceptional contributions to geology. Those geologists were quick to interpret them as the result of slow and gradual processes because they could not accept that their view was not the correct one, for they had the education and the expertise to make these determinations, and there was no need to listen to others with any different idea. I pray that this never becomes our position. In all things, there are other views that must be considered. Sometimes, even the most insignificant observation from the least obvious observer will hold the key to unlocking the secrets holding us from our desired knowledge. I am fond of saying, I have never learned anything of great importance from one who agreed with me totally. One learns from hearing different views and testing those views and integrating those of merit into his own. Do not spend time in useless argument with those who would play the role of the 6 challenging elders. These people are not there to learn, but to keep others from learning. Those who would label us as kooks and popes or high priestesses and warn all who will listen to not drink the Kool-Aid are merely obfuscating the scene and blurring the truth. All views must be investigated and treated according to their own merit. Do not trust science as being some altruistic, dedicated to the truth and honesty type of organization that has only the best for the world in mind. In fact, those within that faction are as hardwired to politicians as any group, and far more so than most. I have had full professors describe to me the problems of involving themselves in this research and maintaining their professional standing. In Canada recently, I and my partners presented some of our findings concerning our Alpha project that studies the glyphs and written language and art of the Sasquatch people. At that gathering, a doctor, a PhD, a professor at a major university stood and said, "In my position, I could not begin to undertake such a study as I see here tonight. My associates would fry me alive if I did, but I'm certainly glad to see that there are those with the guts to put it forth and study things that to present to the rest of us. For that I say, thank you, Dr. Bindernagel." Another prime example of this political correctness of the scientific community arose with the scandal surrounding the warming of our planet. Let me preface this by stating that we have just been talking about an ice sheet from 1 mile to 2 miles thick that existed exactly where I am now sitting reciting this essay. That is not there today, so obviously the Earth is warmer now than it was 14,000 years or so ago. Yes, the Earth has warmed. The scandal concerns the political aspects of blaming that warming on man and his machines. In fact, at the time of the melting of that ice, there were no SUVs. There were no coal-fired power plants, no aluminum factories. It was an act of God, or, if you wish, a natural occurrence. It was a function of sunspot activity, not of carbon buildup. In the era of the Al Gore prophecies, science set out to prove his claims to be true and could find no such evidence. So they manufactured it. They cooked their test result to give the indications they needed and were caught red-handed doing it. The scandal was labeled ClimateGate and was mentioned briefly on the 5 o'clock news before moving on to other, more lucrative pursuits. Even today, the political establishment is attempting to shepherd society into their models of what this society should be, and that evidently does not include the personal freedom of your own vehicle. So they are still trying to perpetuate the myth. And this is the same science that claims to be pure.